Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in Mississippi history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In 1855, the Mississippi Delta stretched endlessly under oppressive summer heat, where cotton fields whispered secrets that the wind carried across plantation grounds. The Magnolia Ridge estate sat like a monument to southern prosperity, its white columns gleaming against Spanish moss that hung like funeral shrouds from ancient oak trees. What happened within those walls on the night of August 14th would forever stain the red clay soil of Tunica County. The bride's name was Charlotte Evangeline Whitmore, 23 years old, daughter of tobacco merchant Edmund Whitmore from Natchez. Her groom, plantation owner Nathaniel Augustus Pemberton, was 41, a widower whose first wife had died in childbirth 3 years prior. The marriage had been arranged through correspondence between their families, as was customary among Mississippi's landed gentry. What guests at that wedding feast could never have imagined was that they were attending their own funeral banquet. If you're enjoying the story and feel like helping the channel with any amount, please support us by clicking the thanks button and donating whatever you wish. This really helps the channel keep posting new stories. The investigation that followed would uncover a web of deception so intricate that local authorities struggled to piece together the truth. Court records from the Tunica County Courthouse, many of which were damaged during the Civil War but partially preserved in the state archives, paint a picture of a celebration that began with southern grandeur and ended in unspeakable tragedy. Before the horror descended upon Magnolia Ridge, life at the plantation followed the predictable rhythms of the antebellum South. Nathaniel Pemberton had inherited the estate from his father in 1848, along with nearly 200 enslaved workers and 3,000 acres of prime cotton land. The main house, built in the Greek Revival style, boasted 12 rooms and a sweeping veranda that overlooked the Mississippi River. Neighbors described Pemberton as a stern but fair master, though former slaves who gave testimony years later during Reconstruction painted a different picture entirely. Charlotte Whitmore had arrived at Magnolia Ridge 2 weeks before the wedding, accompanied by her personal maid and a trunk containing her trousseau. Local seamstresses had spent months preparing her wedding gown, a creation of ivory silk with Belgian lace that had cost more than most families earned in a year. The bride-to-be was described by household staff as quiet and reserved, spending long hours in the mansion's library reading medical texts that seemed unusual for a woman of her station. Dr. Marcus Beauregard, the plantation physician who treated both the Pemberton family and their workers, noted in his journal that Miss Whitmore possessed an unusual knowledge of herbs and their properties. She had requested access to the plantation's medicinal garden, claiming she wished to study native plants for their healing applications. This detail would prove crucial to investigators in the weeks that followed the wedding tragedy. The morning of August 14th dawned clear and humid, with temperatures climbing toward 90 degrees before noon. Wedding preparations had been underway since dawn, with kitchen slaves preparing a feast that would feed over 100 guests. The menu included roasted venison, honey-glazed ham, cornbread stuffing, butter beans, sweet potato pie, and various jellies and preserves made from the plantation's fruit orchards. Most significantly, there would be syllabub, a traditional southern wedding drink made with wine, sugar, and cream. Among the invited guests were prominent families from across the Delta region. The Ashfords had traveled from their plantation near Vicksburg, the Caldwells came from Greenwood, and the influential Morrison family made the journey from their estate outside Memphis. Also in attendance were local merchants, the Episcopal minister who would perform the ceremony, and various business associates of the Pemberton family. Each guest would later become part of the most puzzling mass poisoning case in Mississippi's recorded history. The ceremony itself proceeded without incident. Reverend Samuel Hutchinson of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in nearby Clarksdale performed the service in the Plantation's formal parlor, as the summer heat made an outdoor ceremony unbearable. Witnesses described Charlotte as pale but composed, though several noted that her hands trembled noticeably when she spoke her vows. Nathaniel appeared confident and pleased, occasionally placing a reassuring hand on his bride's arm. Following the ceremony, guests were invited to the dining hall for the wedding feast. The room had been decorated with white roses and honeysuckle, and crystal chandeliers cast dancing light across the assembled company. Tables groaned under the weight of the prepared foods, and servants circulated with silver trays of syllabub, the traditional wedding toast drink that Charlotte herself had insisted on preparing, according to her grandmother's recipe. The first sign that something was amiss came approximately 30 minutes after the toasting began. Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, wife of Memphis cotton broker James Morrison, suddenly clutched her throat and began gasping for air. Within moments, similar symptoms appeared among other guests. Dr. Beauregard, who had been enjoying his second glass of syllabub, noticed his vision beginning to blur and his pulse becoming irregular. By his own account, recorded in a statement given 3 days later when he had recovered enough to speak, the symptoms suggested plant alkaloid poisoning. What followed was a scene that witnesses struggled to describe coherently in their later testimonies. Guests began collapsing throughout the dining hall, some convulsing violently, while others simply crumpled to the floor. The Reverend Hutchinson was found beneath the dessert table, his face a disturbing shade of blue. Young Thomas Ashford, only 19 years old, was discovered in the garden, where he had apparently tried to induce vomiting by forcing his fingers down his throat. The plantation's overseer, Daniel McKenna, who had not partaken of the syllabub due to his Presbyterian beliefs about alcohol consumption, immediately ordered the house servants to summon every available physician within 20 miles. By evening, 3 doctors had arrived from surrounding counties, but their efforts to treat the affected guests proved largely futile. Of the 87 people who consumed the syllabub that night, 31 would be dead before sunrise. Nathaniel Pemberton was among the first to succumb. His new wife found his body in their marriage chamber, where he had apparently retreated when the symptoms became overwhelming. Charlotte's screams, heard throughout the house around midnight, brought servants running to the master bedroom. They discovered the bride kneeling beside her husband's bed, her white wedding gown stained with his blood. She claimed he had been violently ill and had begged her to help him, but by the time she understood the severity of his condition, it was too late. Strangely, Charlotte herself showed no symptoms of poisoning, despite having been seen drinking the syllabub during the toasts. When questioned by Dr. Beauregard, she explained that she had only pretended to drink, as she was feeling nervous about the wedding night and feared the alcohol might make her ill. This explanation satisfied most observers initially, though it would later raise significant questions among investigators. The immediate aftermath of the tragedy was chaos. Surviving guests who were able to travel departed Magnolia Ridge as quickly as their conditions allowed, many requiring assistance from family members or servants. The Caldwell family lost both parents, but their twin daughters, who had been too young to partake of alcohol, survived. The Morrison family suffered the loss of both James and Adelaide, leaving their 3 children orphaned. Local authorities arrived the following morning in the person of Sheriff William Crawford from the county seat at Hernando. Crawford had dealt with occasional murders and disputes common to plantation life, but nothing had prepared him for the scale of death at Magnolia Ridge. His initial report, filed with the circuit court, described the scene as resembling a battlefield more than a wedding celebration. Dr. Edmund Hayes, a physician from Memphis with experience in toxicology cases, was summoned to examine the bodies and conduct what passed for forensic investigation in 1855 Mississippi. His findings, preserved in county records, indicated that the victims had died from what he termed vegetable poisoning, likely from a plant-based alkaloid that had been dissolved in the syllabub. The symptoms described by survivors were consistent with several native plants known to be highly toxic, including water hemlock and white snake root. The investigation took a significant turn when servants reported that Charlotte had spent considerable time in the kitchen on the morning of the wedding, claiming she wanted to personally oversee the preparation of the syllabub. Kitchen staff testified that she had brought her own ingredients, including what she described as a special honey from her family's apiary in Natchez. More troubling was the testimony of the head cook, an enslaved woman named Celia, who stated that Charlotte had insisted on being alone while she mixed the final batch of the wedding drink. When confronted with this evidence, Charlotte maintained her innocence while expressing profound grief over the loss of her husband and the other victims. She claimed that her presence in the kitchen had been motivated by a desire to honor family tradition and ensure that the syllabub was prepared exactly as her grandmother had taught her. The honey, she insisted, had been a wedding gift from her father and was intended to make the drink particularly special for the occasion. However, Dr. Hayes's investigation of Charlotte's belongings revealed several concerning items. Hidden in a small compartment of her travel trunk were dried plant specimens that he identified as water hemlock root, along with a mortar and pestle that showed traces of ground plant material. Also discovered were several letters from her father that suggested the Whitmore family's financial situation was far more precarious than they had led the Pembertons to believe. The motive for the poisoning began to emerge as investigators delved deeper into the circumstances surrounding the arranged marriage. Edmund Whitmore's tobacco business had been failing for several years due to poor harvests and mounting debts. The marriage to Nathaniel Pemberton represented not just social advancement for his daughter, but potential financial salvation for his family. Under Mississippi law, Charlotte would inherit her husband's estate if he died without children from his first marriage. What investigators discovered was that Nathaniel's first wife had indeed died in childbirth, but the infant had survived and was being raised by relatives in New Orleans. This fact had been concealed from the Whitmore family during marriage negotiations, as Nathaniel feared it might complicate the arrangement. If Charlotte had learned of the child's existence, she would have known that her inheritance rights were not as clear-cut as she might have believed. The case took another dramatic turn when investigators interviewed Dr. Beauregard more thoroughly about Charlotte's interest in medicinal plants. He revealed that she had asked specific questions about dosages and the effects of various toxic plants on the human system. She had claimed to be researching traditional remedies for common ailments, but her questions had focused specifically on plants that could cause rapid death when consumed in sufficient quantities. Sheriff Crawford's investigation also uncovered evidence that Charlotte had made inquiries about the guest list for the wedding, specifically asking about which families would be attending and whether children would be present. When told that most guests would be adults and that children would not partake of alcoholic beverages, she had seemed relieved. This suggested to investigators that she had planned the poisoning carefully to avoid harming young people while maximizing the impact on adult witnesses to her husband's death. The most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Reverend Hutchinson, who had survived the poisoning but remained gravely ill for weeks, had managed to write a brief note before losing consciousness on the night of the wedding. In his final moments of clarity, he had observed Charlotte in the dining hall during the height of the crisis, and his note described her behavior as unnaturally calm for someone witnessing such horror. He wrote that she had moved among the dying guests with what appeared to be clinical interest rather than grief or shock. As the investigation progressed, a clearer picture emerged of Charlotte's character and motivations. Former slaves who had worked in the Whitmore household described her as intelligent but cold, with a fascination for chemistry and medicine that was unusual for women of her social class. They recalled incidents where small animals on the plantation had died mysteriously after Charlotte had been experimenting with various plant preparations. The formal charges against Charlotte Evangeline Whitmore were filed in September of 1855. She was accused of first-degree murder in the death of her husband and 30 counts of additional murder for the other victims. The trial was scheduled to be one of the most significant criminal proceedings in Mississippi's antebellum history, drawing attention from newspapers across the South. However, justice would prove elusive. On the night before jury selection was to begin, Charlotte was found dead in her cell at the Tunica County Jail. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by hanging, though several suspicious circumstances surrounded her demise. The rope used had been braided from threads pulled from her dress, but investigators noted that the knots showed a sophistication that seemed beyond what a distraught woman might accomplish. More puzzling was the discovery of a small vial hidden in Charlotte's cell, containing traces of the same plant alkaloid that had killed the wedding guests. How she had obtained this substance while in custody was never determined, leading some to speculate that she had accomplices who helped orchestrate her death to prevent embarrassing revelations during the trial. The aftermath of the Magnolia Ridge tragedy haunted Tunica County for generations. The plantation itself was sold to pay debts and satisfy wrongful death claims from victims' families. The main house stood empty for several years before being purchased by a family from Tennessee, though they never felt comfortable living there and eventually demolished the structure in 1868. Local folklore developed around the case, with some claiming that Charlotte had been involved in witchcraft or had made a pact with evil forces. These supernatural explanations were likely attempts to make sense of a crime that seemed almost incomprehensibly calculated in its cruelty. The reality was probably more mundane, but no less chilling. A young woman driven by desperation and greed had committed mass murder with scientific precision. The investigation files were eventually transferred to Jackson when Mississippi established its state archive system. But many documents were lost during the Civil War when Union forces occupied the capital. What remains provides a fragmentary but disturbing glimpse into one of the antebellum South's darkest chapters. Dr. Hayes's final report, completed months after Charlotte's death, concluded that she had likely been planning the poisoning for weeks before arriving at Magnolia Ridge. The quantity of toxic plant material found in her possession suggested she had prepared enough poison to kill far more than the number of actual victims. His analysis indicated that only the guests' varying body weights and the uneven distribution of the poisoned syllabub had prevented an even greater catastrophe. The case influenced Mississippi's legal system in unexpected ways. Recognizing the difficulty of investigating such complex crimes, the state legislature eventually passed laws requiring better documentation of suspicious deaths and establishing protocols for handling mass casualty events. These changes would prove valuable during the yellow fever epidemics that periodically devastated the Mississippi River Valley. Families of the victims struggled with the aftermath for years. The Morrison children were eventually taken in by relatives in Virginia, while the surviving Caldwell twins were raised by their maternal grandparents. Many of the affected families left Mississippi entirely, unable to bear the memories associated with the Delta region. The economic impact was also significant, as several of the murdered guests had been major landowners whose deaths disrupted cotton production and local commerce. Perhaps most disturbing was the realization that Charlotte's crime had been entirely preventable. Had Nathaniel been honest about his surviving child, had her father been truthful about his financial situation, Or had anyone recognized the warning signs of her dangerous obsessions, 32 people might have lived to see another sunrise. Instead, a web of deception and social expectations had created the perfect conditions for tragedy. The medical community also learned from the case. Dr. Hayes published a detailed analysis of plant poisoning symptoms in a medical journal, helping other physicians recognize and treat similar cases. His work became a standard reference for toxicology studies throughout the 19th century, though he always expressed regret that his knowledge had come at such a terrible cost. Archives from the period suggest that there may have been other suspicious deaths connected to Charlotte Whitmore. A review of mortality records from Natchez during the years before her marriage revealed several unexplained deaths among elderly residents who had been patients of a local healer who matched Charlotte's description. However, these connections were never formally investigated, leaving questions that will likely never be answered. The broader social implications of the case resonated throughout Mississippi society. The idea that a refined young woman from a respected family could commit such calculated murder challenged assumptions about feminine nature and social class. Newspaper editorials from the period struggled to explain how someone who appeared to embody Southern womanly ideals could harbor such deadly intentions. Religious communities were particularly shaken by the case. The fact that the poisoning had occurred immediately after a Christian wedding ceremony and that a minister had been among the victims raised uncomfortable questions about divine protection and the presence of evil in everyday life. Several churches in the region held special prayer services in the months following the tragedy, seeking spiritual understanding of how such horror could occur in their midst. The economic ramifications extended beyond the immediate families involved. Insurance companies, still relatively new in the antebellum South, faced unprecedented claims from the mass poisoning incident. This led to more stringent policies regarding coverage for violent deaths and helped establish precedents for handling large-scale casualty events that would influence the industry's development for decades. Legal scholars who studied the case noted its significance in establishing precedent for prosecuting cases involving multiple murders with a single criminal act. The complexity of determining individual versus collective intent in mass poisoning cases required new approaches to criminal law that influenced judicial proceedings throughout the region. As the Civil War approached, the Magnolia Ridge case took on additional symbolic meaning. Some abolitionists pointed to the tragedy as evidence of the moral corruption inherent in plantation society, while Southern defenders argued that it represented an isolated incident that reflected individual evil rather than systemic problems. These competing interpretations became part of the broader cultural debate about the nature of antebellum Southern civilization. The physical evidence from the case was eventually lost or destroyed. The toxic plants that had been preserved for the trial were disposed of after Charlotte's death, deemed too dangerous to keep. The chemical analysis equipment used by Dr. Hayes was primitive by later standards, but his conclusions about the specific type of plant alkaloid involved were later confirmed by more sophisticated testing methods when similar cases occurred. Decades later, during Reconstruction, former slaves from Magnolia Ridge provided additional testimony about the events surrounding the wedding. Their accounts, recorded by Freedmen's Bureau officials, revealed details about Charlotte's behavior that had not been included in the original investigation. These testimonies painted a picture of a woman who had displayed disturbing behavior well before the wedding, including incidents where she had tested various plant preparations on small animals. The case influenced literature and folklore throughout the Mississippi Delta. Local writers created fictional accounts based on the events, though these stories often added supernatural elements that obscured the real horror of the calculated murder. These romanticized versions contributed to a mythology that persisted well into the 20th century, making it difficult for historians to separate fact from legend. Educational institutions eventually used the case as a teaching tool for medical and legal students. The complexity of the toxicological evidence and the legal precedents established made it valuable for training purposes, though instructors always emphasized the tragic cost of the knowledge gained. Law schools particularly focused on the challenges of prosecuting cases where the primary suspect died before trial. Modern forensic techniques would likely have revealed additional evidence about the crime. Chemical analysis of the victim's remains, psychological profiling of the perpetrator, and more sophisticated investigation methods might have provided clearer answers to some of the lingering questions. However, the basic facts of the case remain clear. A young woman used scientific knowledge to commit mass murder for financial gain, demonstrating a level of premeditation and callousness that shocked even the violence-accustomed society of antebellum Mississippi. The legacy of August 14, 1855, extended far beyond Tunica County. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of arranged marriages, the importance of honest communication between families, and the potential for education to be used for evil purposes. It also highlighted the vulnerability of social gatherings to deliberate poisoning, leading to changes in how food and drink were prepared and served at large events throughout the region. As the years passed and direct memory of the tragedy faded, Magnolia Ridge became a symbol of how quickly joy could turn to horror, how appearances could deceive, and how the pursuit of wealth and status could corrupt even those who seemed most refined and civilized. The empty foundation stones of the plantation house, gradually overgrown by kudzu and honeysuckle, served as a silent reminder of the 32 lives lost to one woman's calculated greed. And perhaps most haunting of all was the realization that somewhere in those Mississippi archives, filed away and forgotten, lay the full truth about Charlotte Evangeline Whitmore, a truth that died with her in that jail cell, taking its secrets to whatever judgment awaited beyond the grave. The syllabub recipe she used that night was never recovered, though local families burned any similar preparations they possessed, unable to bear the thought of recreating, even accidentally, the drink that had brought such devastation to their community. To this day, when summer storms roll across the delta and the wind moves through the cotton fields where Magnolia Ridge once stood, old-timers claim they can still hear the echoes of that wedding celebration, the laughter and music that preceded the silence, the toasts that became death sentences, and the dreams that died along with the guests who trusted in the traditional hospitality of the antebellum South, never suspecting that their hostess had prepared their final meal with hands as cold and calculating as the Mississippi winter that followed that terrible August night. The final investigation report, filed in December of 1855 and sealed for 20 years, contained one last disturbing revelation. Among Charlotte's personal effects, investigators found a detailed journal documenting her preparation for the wedding massacre. Written in a careful, almost clinical hand, the entries revealed the full extent of her planning and the chilling rationality behind her actions. The journal entries began 3 months before the wedding, shortly after the marriage arrangement had been finalized. Charlotte had systematically researched the guest list, noting which families held significant wealth and which individuals might pose threats to her future inheritance claims. She had calculated dosages based on estimated body weights and had even practiced her poison preparation techniques on stray cats around the Whitmore property. Most shocking was her contingency planning. The journal revealed that if the mass poisoning had failed to kill Nathaniel, she had prepared additional methods to eliminate him over the following weeks. She had also considered scenarios where surviving guests might suspect her involvement, outlining strategies to deflect suspicion and maintain her facade of grieving innocence. The final entry, written on the morning of her wedding day, contained a single chilling line. "Today I become a widow and an heiress. History will remember this day, though not as I will tell it." Sheriff Crawford made the decision to permanently seal these records, believing that the full details of Charlotte's planning were too disturbing for public consumption. The families of the victims were informed only that conclusive evidence had been found confirming her guilt, sparing them the knowledge of how methodically their loved ones had been selected for death. The case officially closed in 1856 with Charlotte's death, though questions lingered in the minds of those who had lived through the horror. The Tunica County Courthouse eventually burned in 1873, destroying most remaining physical evidence from the investigation. The few surviving documents were transferred to state archives, where they remained largely forgotten until historian Dr. Margaret Thornton discovered them in 1962 while researching antebellum crime patterns. Dr. Thornton's subsequent academic paper, published in 1964 in the Journal of Southern Historical Studies, brought renewed attention to the case, but failed to resolve its remaining mysteries. Her research confirmed the basic facts, but was unable to locate any surviving descendants of the key participants who might provide additional insights. The land where Magnolia Ridge once stood was eventually converted to cotton fields during the agricultural mechanization of the early 20th century. Local farmers occasionally turned up fragments of china or pieces of iron from the original plantation infrastructure, but these artifacts were typically discarded as worthless remnants of a past best forgotten. In 1968, the Mississippi Department of Archives and History conducted a final review of the case files before transferring them to permanent storage. Their conclusion was that the Magnolia Ridge wedding massacre represented one of the most calculated mass murders in American history, notable for both its premeditation and the social status of its perpetrator. The reviewing historians noted that Charlotte Evangeline Whitmore had exploited the social conventions of her era with deadly efficiency. Her apparent refinement and education had provided perfect cover for her murderous intentions, while the arranged marriage system had delivered her victims directly into her hands. The case served as a dark reminder that evil could wear the most civilized of faces. Today, the site of Magnolia Ridge lies beneath a soybean field off Highway 61, unmarked except for a historical marker placed by the county in 1976. The marker makes no mention of the wedding massacre, referring only to the plantation's agricultural significance in the antebellum period. Local residents rarely speak of what happened there, and many newcomers to the area remain unaware of the tragedy that once stained that particular stretch of Mississippi soil. The syllabub recipe died with Charlotte, and perhaps that is for the best. Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve, some traditions too tainted to continue. The 32 victims of that August night in 1855 found their final rest in cemeteries across the Delta, their deaths a permanent reminder that monsters can emerge from the most unexpected places, wearing the most innocent of faces. And in the end, Charlotte Evangeline Whitmore achieved a form of immortality she likely never intended, not as a wealthy plantation mistress, but as a cautionary tale about the depths of human calculation and cruelty. Her name remains whispered in Tunica County when the summer heat grows oppressive and the cotton fields lie still under the Delta sun, a reminder that some weddings end not with joy and new beginnings, but with death and the bitter taste of betrayal that lingers long after the last guest has been buried and the final testimony given. The sound that still echoes across those fields is not the laughter of celebration, but the silence that followed, the terrible, permanent silence of 32 lives cut short by a bride who chose poison over love, calculation over compassion, and murder over the simple honesty that might have prevented it all.